December 26, 1944, 4:50 in the afternoon. Outside the encircled Belgian town of Bastogne, a Sherman tank named Cobra King grinds forward through churned snow toward the perimeter held by the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. Cobra King is a heavyweight, an M4A3E2 jumbo, a Sherman variant whose 42-ton hull carries an extra layer of armor over the front and sides. It is commanded by 1st Lieutenant Charles Boggess of C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. The temperature is below freezing. The road has been fought over for hours by lighter Shermans of the same battalion. German artillery is still falling on the column. The lead tanks have already lost crew. In the next 20 minutes, Cobra King will break through. The siege of Bastogne, the most famous defensive stand of the Western campaign, will end. The paratroopers in the snow will see an American tank coming through the trees, and they will know the relief column has arrived. What few people know about that moment is that Cobra King had no business being there at all. A few weeks earlier, in November of 1944, the same tank had been hit and disabled in France. By every standard, the German army would have applied to a Panther in the same condition. The war would have ended for it then. But Cobra King was American. It was hauled to a vehicle collecting point. Its damage was assessed. It was repaired, returned to its crew, and sent back into combat. By the time it reached Bastogne, it was carrying both the relief of an airborne division and the signature of an American maintenance system that had become, by the winter of 1944, the most efficient battlefield recovery network the world had ever seen. This is the story of how the United States Army turned tank repair into a system, and how that system, more than the tank itself, defeated the most technically sophisticated armored force the world had ever seen. This is the story of the men who kept Shermans running when the Germans, with all their engineering genius, simply could not. The vehicle that pulled Cobra King out of the mud the first time, and the dozens of tanks that followed it, was an M32 tank recovery vehicle. It was the unsung workhorse of American armored warfare in the European theater, and the centerpiece of a maintenance philosophy that produced something the Germans never managed to build, an industrial system that could put a damaged tank back into combat in 24 to 72 hours. To understand what the Americans were doing, you first have to understand what they were doing it with. The M4 Sherman was the second most produced tank of the Second World War. The United States built roughly 49,324 of them between 1942 and 1945. The total exceeds the combined production of every German tank destroyer, and every German assault gun, by a wide margin. Only the Soviet T-34, with around 84,000 built, was produced in greater numbers. The Sherman was not the most heavily armored tank of the war. It was not the fastest. It did not have the largest gun, except in the British Firefly variant. What it had instead was something far more important. It had a system behind it. The Sherman was built by 11 different manufacturers across North America, 10 in the United States, 1 in Canada. Chrysler operated the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, the largest and most famous of the production sites. The plant was designed by the architect Albert Kahn and constructed in roughly 9 months, between September of 1940 and the spring of 1941. Tanks were rolling out of it before the building itself was finished. In December of 1942, the Detroit Tank Arsenal set a wartime monthly record of 896 Shermans produced in a single month. The plant would build more than 22,000 tanks across the course of the war, more than any other single facility on Earth. The other manufacturers told the same story. Pressed Steel Car of Joliet, Illinois, built more than 8,000 Shermans. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, was the second largest producer, and the home of the M4A3E2 Jumbo, the heavily armored assault variant Cobra King belonged to. American Locomotive built 2,300. Baldwin Locomotive Works built 1,245. Ford Motor Company, Federal Machine and Welder, Pullman Standard, Pacific Car and Foundry, Lima Locomotive Works, and Montreal Locomotive Works in Canada filled out the rest. Each of these factories was building tanks that could be repaired with parts from any of the others. That was the most important thing about the Sherman. Not the engine, not the armor, not the gun. The standardization. A track link cast in Joliet would fit a tank welded in Detroit. A final drive housing forged in Grand Blanc could replace one shattered by a German mine in the Hürtgen forest, regardless of which factory had produced the original tank. Every Sherman of every variant, with very few exceptions, used the same crew compartment dimensions, the same bolted three-piece transmission cover at the front of the hull, the same lift-off engine deck at the rear, and the same basic running gear architecture. This was a deliberate engineering choice. The Sherman was bounded from the start by what could fit on standard American railroad cars, what could cross military pontoon bridges, what could be loaded into the holds of Liberty ships, and what could be lifted by the dockyard cranes of foreign ports. The Ordnance Department imposed those limits on the design before a single bolt was tightened. The result was a tank that weighed roughly 30 to 33 tons in its early variants, that grew to 38 tons in the M4, a 376mm version with horizontal volute spring suspension, and that capped out at 42 tons in the Jumbo. It had a 5-man crew. It had a road speed of about 26 miles per hour. It had a range of 130 miles. Early production tanks carried 51mm of armor on the hull front, sloped at 56 degrees. Later, large hatch hulls increased the plate to 63.5mm at a 47-degree angle, with effective protection roughly equivalent in both cases. The 75mm main gun was the standard fit in early production. A higher-velocity 76mm version of the gun entered production in January of 1944 and reached combat units in northwestern Europe by the summer of that year. But none of those numbers tell you why the Sherman won. The Sherman won because, on a continent at war, with parts and fuel and trained men flowing across an ocean 3,000 miles wide, the system around the tank was stronger than any individual tank that opposed it. The Sherman was also affordable. A typical Sherman cost the United States roughly $50,000 in mature production. A Tiger I cost the German treasury about 250,000 Reichsmarks, exclusive of its weapons and radio. For the cost of a single B-17 bomber, the United States could build several Shermans. For the cost of a single B-29, more than a dozen. It was an industrial achievement on a scale Germany could not match, would never match, and at some level seems never to have understood. Funded by the full taxing power of the largest economy on earth, the Sherman was the physical expression of what President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. It was paid for by income taxes, war bonds, factory shifts, and the ordinary working hours of millions of Americans, including the 85,000 civilian women, the so-called women ordnance workers, who were part of a wartime ordnance workforce of 262,000 civilians, staffing production lines while their husbands and brothers fought overseas. By the time the Sherman entered combat in mass numbers in 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had reached a turning point. The Soviet Union had inflicted a decisive strategic defeat on the Wehrmacht at Kursk in the summer of 1943. The Western Allies had taken Sicily, then mainland Italy, then Rome. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history put American, British, and Canadian forces ashore in Normandy. From that day forward, the war in the West became a campaign of armoured advance, of breaking through hedgerows, crossing rivers, smashing fortified towns, and chasing a retreating enemy across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally into Germany itself. That kind of campaign devours tanks. It devours them by the dozen, then by the 100, then by the 1,000. In a strange way, the Sherman entered this campaign already outclassed by certain technical measures. The German Panther, introduced in 1943, had thicker, better sloped armor and a longer-barreled, higher-velocity 75mm gun that could punch through a Sherman's frontal plate at extreme range. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, carried an 88mm cannon, adapted from an anti-aircraft gun, and was almost invulnerable to a Sherman's 75mm shell from the front. By 1944, German engineers were producing the Tiger II, with even thicker armor and an even longer 88. In any one-on-one engagement at long range, the Sherman could be at a disadvantage against either of those vehicles. Allied tank crews knew this. They talked about it. They wrote home about it. Some of them, decades later, would write books about it. The most famous of those books, Belton Cooper's Death Traps, published in 1998, gave the world the bitter image of Shermans, burning by the dozen on the fields of France, their crews trapped inside, while gleaming panthers picked them off from concealed positions in the tree lines. That image is partly true. It is also partly misleading. and the part that is misleading is exactly the part this story is about. To understand the men who fixed the Shermans, you have to understand who they were. They were not, for the most part, the men in the gun turrets. The American Heavy Armored Division of 1944 had about 16,000 men in it. Roughly 2,000 of those were maintenance soldiers, organized into a divisional ordnance maintenance battalion and the maintenance companies of the two armored regiments. Hundreds of others were drivers and assistant drivers in trucks, half-tracks, and self-propelled guns, all of whom performed first-echelon maintenance on their own vehicles every single day. These were welders from Pennsylvania steel towns. They were Ford and Chevrolet mechanics from the Midwest, who had spent the 1930s tearing apart Model T transmissions in country garages. They were farm boys who had kept tractors running through the Dust Bowl with baling wire and improvisation. They were railroad machinists, oil rig hands, plumbers, electricians, and small-town tinkerers. The United States, almost alone among the major belligerents, had a civilian population dense with mechanical knowledge because it had spent 30 years building the most heavily motorized economy on the planet. When that population went to war, it brought its wrenches with it. They were trained at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the Ordnance Specialist School, with billeting space at peak for more than 24,000 enlisted men and 2,300 officers. Tank mechanics were trained on the running gear, drivetrain, and gun systems of every American armored vehicle. Ordnance officers were trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky, at the Armored Force School, where Belton Cooper himself had received his commission. Heavy equipment mechanics also passed through Red River Army Depot in Texas, activated in the early 1940s, and through the Ordnance Training Camp at Camp Hancock, a legacy installation from the First World War. The Ordnance Corps, as an institution, dated back to May 14, 1812. By 1944, it had become something the United States had never had before, an industrial logistics machine on a continental scale. Across the war, the Ordnance Department supplied 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 11 million tons of artillery ammunition, 12 million rifles and carbines, and 3.5 million military vehicles. It was, in human terms, an army of mechanics, machinists, riveters, welders, parts clerks, and supply officers, and the largest such organization in human history. A typical day for one of these men, in early October of 1944, in a woodlot somewhere east of the Belgian border, began before dawn. At about 5:30, the company stood to. The first echelon of maintenance, the daily preventive checks, began at 6. Track tension, engine oil, coolant. Each grease point on the hull and turret located, cleaned, and lubricated. The driver pulled the floor plates and inspected the propeller shaft running the length of the hull from the rear engine to the forward transmission. The loader checked the breech of the 75mm. The bow gunner pulled the receiver of the 30 caliber Browning and ran a brush down its barrel. By 7, the liaison officer left in a jeep. He carried with him the previous day's loss reports, the requisition forms for replacement tanks, and the coordinates of vehicles that had been disabled the day before but could not be recovered before nightfall. He was, in effect, the connective tissue between the men with rifles and the men with wrenches. Officers like Belton Cooper performed this role for Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division. They drove through what Cooper later called the void, the gap of a few miles to as many as 50 miles between the front-line armor and the trailing infantry, where bypassed German strongpoints could still ambush a single jeep. Between 7 in the morning and noon, the vehicle collecting point, the central node of the system, took in tanks. Some came in under their own power, limping on a damaged final drive or with a torn track replaced in the field. Others came in on the end of an M32's tow cable, dragged backward through the mud by a recovery vehicle that had braved direct fire to reach them. Each tank was triaged on arrival. Repairable in less than 24 hours. Repairable in less than 72. Evacuate to corps-level heavy maintenance. Cannibalize for parts. Cannibalization was the secret art of American armored sustainment. When the 3rd Armored Division entered combat near Airel in Normandy on June 29, 1944, its maintenance leadership, including Major A.C. Arrington, looked at the first day's loss reports and made decisions that would define the rest of the campaign. The order went out to cannibalize aggressively any tank that could not be made to run again within 48 hours, and to streamline replacement vehicle requests so the supply cycle would not bog down in paperwork. Within weeks, every burned-out Sherman became a parts depot on tracks. Final drives, radiators, gun barrels, optics, machine guns, road wheels, periscopes, all of it was salvaged before the hulk was hauled away. The afternoons were given to the heavy work. Power pack swaps, the removal and replacement of an entire engine, were performed in 8 to 12 hours by a 4-man team using the boom of an M32. Track repairs took an hour. Final drive replacement on a Sherman, the same job that took German mechanics days to do on a Panther, took less than a day. Gun replacements were straightforward. The 75mm and the 76mm could be removed from the turret in their entirety, and a fresh tube slid into place. After dark, the work continued under tarps. Welders, working with arc rods, drew shelter halves over the back ends of tanks to mask the blue glare of the welding flame. The slightest light could be seen for miles by a low-flying German night intruder. Crews caught catnaps when they could. Some men worked 3 days and nights with almost no sleep. In all of this, the M32 tank recovery vehicle was the indispensable instrument. It was built on the chassis of an M4 Sherman, which is to say, it shared every running gear part, every track link, every road wheel, every drive sprocket with the tanks it was rescuing. In the place of the turret, it carried a fixed armoured superstructure. Inside that superstructure was a Garwood winch, capable of pulling 60,000 pounds, or 30 short tons. Folded against the hull was an 18-footer frame boom. Mounted on the front of the superstructure was an 81mm mortar with smoke rounds, used not as a weapon of attack but as a smokescreen generator to mask recoveries under fire. The vehicle carried one 50 caliber Browning M2 and one 30 caliber Browning M1919 machine gun, plus a 4-man crew. Combat weight was about 29 short tons. Production of the M32 series ran across at least 4 manufacturers. Lima Locomotive Works built 5 pilot vehicles, plus another 46. Pressed steel car converted around 845. Used Sherman hulls into recovery vehicles in 1944. Federal Machine and Welder produced almost 400 more before war's end. Baldwin Locomotive Works added another 180 in 1945. The total across all variants came to roughly 1,500 to 1,700 vehicles, distributed 2 per medium tank battalion service company, plus another in each medium tank company headquarters platoon. That meant that every American tank battalion in Europe had, at minimum, 3 vehicles dedicated solely to the recovery of its own combat losses. Multiplied across the dozens of armoured battalions in the theatre, it meant a continuous, distributed, constantly moving fleet of armoured tow trucks, capable of operating under direct fire, equipped to drag any disabled American or German tank off any battlefield in northwestern Europe. To this you must add the Red Ball Express. From August 25, 1944, until November 16 of that same year, almost 6,000 trucks, mostly the General Motors CCKW 2.5 ton, the Deuce and a half, ran a continuous loop from the Normandy beachheads to the front. Approximately 3/4 of the drivers were African-American soldiers in a still segregated army. At its peak, the Red Ball moved more than 12,000 tons of supplies a day. Across its 3 months of operation, it delivered roughly 412,000 tons. An American armored division on the offensive could consume hundreds of tons a day, including tens of thousands of gallons of fuel for every 100 miles of advance. The Red Ball brought fuel, ammunition, rations, and most importantly for our story, spare parts, final drives, engines, tracks, gun barrels, wireless sets, the lifeblood of mechanized war. One Sherman driver of the 5th Armored Division said it plainly. "Without the Red Ball," he said, "we would have been sitting in our tanks praying for them to come up." The full story of what this system could accomplish lives in the records of one division above all others. The 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Spearhead, entered combat in Normandy on June 29, 1944. According to figures Belton Cooper preserved in his memoir Death Traps, the division began the campaign with 232 M4 Shermans and 158 M5 light tanks. Across the next 231 days of combat, until the Germans' surrender in May of 1945, it lost 648 Shermans, completely destroyed, and had another 700 or so damaged but recovered, repaired, and returned to combat by its maintenance battalion. These figures, drawn from Cooper's recollection, have been widely repeated in popular histories. Some scholars caution that Cooper compiled them from memory after the war rather than from divisional records, and the precise numbers should be treated with care. Even granting that uncertainty, no responsible historian disputes the underlying picture. The 3rd Armoured Division absorbed tank losses on a scale that would have shattered any German formation, and remained an effective fighting force from the hedgerows of Normandy to the streets of Paderborn. Consider what those numbers mean for one tank crew. A Sherman is hit. The crew bails out, 2 of them wounded. Within hours, an M32 arrives, hooks up a tow cable, and drags the burning hulk back to the vehicle collecting point. Within 72 hours, the tank has a new power pack, new tracks, new optics, and a fresh coat of olive drab paint over the scorch marks. The same crewmen, the ones who survived, are issued a tank with a different bumper number and sent back to their company. Sometimes, in the chaos of a long campaign, the same hull would come back with a new tactical mark, having been written off and resurrected. It is no accident that Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, future namesake of the M1 Abrams main battle tank, commanded a sequence of Shermans named Thunderbolt across the campaign, each of them knocked out and replaced as the maintenance system put a fresh vehicle under his command. The crews knew this system existed. They depended on it. They cursed it on the bad days and were saved by it on the worst. They had in their corner the most concentrated logistics effort the world had ever seen, and they fought, on average, with confidence that if they survived the first hit, they would have a tank again tomorrow. The men in the maintenance battalions paid for this in blood. Ordnance officers performing liaison runs through the void, mechanics caught by artillery while replacing engines, and welders working under tarps in winter blackouts all became casualties. Heavy maintenance companies suffered ship sinkings during the cross-channel build-up. Recovery crews were lost to mines, snipers, and indirect fire. Major General Maurice Rose, commander of the 3rd Armoured Division, was killed on March 30, 1945, near Paderborn, in an unexpected encounter with German armour. Rose was the highest-ranking American officer killed by direct enemy fire in the European theatre. The casualty figures across the United States Army in the war reflect, in their own way, the success of this system. American Sherman crews, on average, suffered fewer dead per disabled tank than Allied tank crews riding any other type, and far fewer than German crews riding the heavier Panzers. The Sherman's 3 turret hatches, large crew openings, and post-1944 wet ammunition stowage all helped men get out. In an army that produced over 49,000 tanks, fielded 16 separate armoured divisions, and fought from North Africa to the Elbe, total American armoured force fatalities ran into the low thousands. It is one of the most striking ratios in all of military history. How was it possible? That is where the story turns. Some have said it was the Sherman itself, with its hatches, its ammunition stowage, and its drivability that saved its men. The Sherman was easy to escape. It was relatively quick to abandon. Its crews could bail out in seconds. There is truth in that. Others have said it was the doctrine, the practice of using tank platoons in combination with infantry, of calling in artillery and air support before tanks were committed against fortified positions. There is truth in that too. Still others have said it was the maintenance and recovery network itself, the M32s, the vehicle collecting points, the Red Ball Express, the cannibalization of write-offs, the parts pipeline running back to Detroit. There is the deepest truth of all. But there is one more answer, and it is the one that is hardest to see from a single battlefield. The answer is contrast. To understand how good the American system was, you have to look at what the Germans were trying to do, and why they could not do it. German tank design philosophy in the second half of the war moved in the opposite direction from American practice. German engineers built tanks that were technically superior in armor, optics, gunpowder, and crew layout, but they were also heavier, more complex, more demanding to maintain, and built in numbers that could never sustain the war Germany was fighting. The Panther was produced in a total of about 6,000 vehicles, the Tiger I in 1,347, the Tiger II in fewer than 500. The Panther's most famous flaw was its final drive. To speed production, German designers had used a simplified double-spur reduction gear instead of a proper planetary or epicyclic system. The high-quality steel originally specified for the part was not available to wartime German industry. The substitute steel used in production, known as VMS 135, had decent yield strength but was not optimal for the application. The result was a final drive whose average fatigue life under combat conditions was about 150 kilometers, far below the design intent. Panthers, in other words, were breaking their drivetrains long before they should have. A planned planetary final drive, scheduled for a later Panther variant, would have fixed the problem. It never entered production. Panther operational availability rates told the story. In the months after Kursk, only a small minority of the Panther fleet was combat-ready. After Maybach's reliability program of 1943 and 1944, average availability rose into the range of 50%. As of March 15, 1945, just 2 months before the German surrender, Panther availability stood at 48%, Tiger I availability at 59%, and Panzer IV availability at 62%. Almost half of the German heavy and medium tank fleet was deadlined at any given time. The Tiger was, in some ways, the more demanding case. The Tank Museum at Bovington in England, which today operates the only running Tiger I in the world, has stated that wartime maintenance of a Tiger required something on the order of 10 hours of work for every hour of operation. Some German wartime documents prescribed lighter schedules in theory, but the field reality, in mud, in cold, with overworked mechanics, was punishing. Major final drive and transmission overhauls on a Tiger could require lifting the 11-ton turret off the hull with a workshop gantry crane, a job possible only at a depot. The interleaved Schachtelaufwerk road wheels meant that to reach a damaged inner wheel, a mechanic might first have to remove several outer ones. In Russian mud and frozen winter conditions, those wheels became locked together by ice, requiring controlled fires, hammers, and hours of labor. Estimates of how long it took to build a Tiger have been contested for 80 years. The wartime Tiger Fable, the field manual issued to crews, gave a figure of 300,000 man-hours per tank. Modern researchers, including Tom Jentz and Hilary Doyle, have argued that the real figure was closer to 150,000. By comparison, a Panther required somewhere on the order of 55,000 man-hours, and late production Shermans, by some estimates, fewer still. Whichever figures one accepts, the conclusion is the same. For the labor required to build one Tiger, German industry could have built several Panzer IVs, or many Shermans, and the German army would have been better off for it. The deepest German failure, however, was not in production. It was in recovery. The German equivalent of the M32 was the Panther, a turretless Panther chassis fitted with a 40-ton winch, a 1.5-ton crane, a rear-mounted spade for anchoring, and a 5-man crew. It was, by specification, a very capable vehicle. 2 or 3 German Famo 18-ton half-tracks, the standard pre-war recovery prime mover, were required to tow a single Tiger or Panther. Only the Panther could do the job alone. Total Panther production across the war is one of the most contested figures in the German tank record. Standard Jentz Panzer Tracks data give a figure in the high 200s for purpose-built vehicles. Other compilations push the number into the low to mid-300s. A widely cited figure from the historian Walter Spielberger gives 297. At least 88 Panthers were delivered without their winches and spurs installed, meaning they were essentially turretless, Panthers used as tugs rather than full recovery vehicles. The truly fully equipped recovery fleet was probably closer to 200 vehicles, distributed 2 to 4 per heavy panzer detachment across the entire German army. Many detachments operated with one, some with none. Compared to the 1,500 to 1,700 American M32s, the ratio was somewhere on the order of 7 or 8 to 1 in raw numbers, and far higher in effective recovery capacity once the supporting parts pipeline was counted. German doctrine acknowledged the problem in the most damning way possible. It explicitly forbade towing a Panther with another Panther, because both tanks' final drives would fail under the load. With Panthers in such short supply, this meant that any Panther that broke down beyond friendly lines, ran out of fuel, threw a track in difficult terrain, or suffered any of the dozens of mechanical failures common to a complex tank, was simply abandoned. The crew would set the fuel on fire, remove the breech block from the gun, and walk back. A handful would attempt to plant thermite charges. Many simply left. In Normandy, July 1944, the Panzer-Lehr Division entered the battle area on the eve of Operation Cobra, with about 2,200 combat troops. 16 Panthers and 12 Panzer IVs were operational. Roughly 30 more tanks of mixed types sat in workshops behind the lines, awaiting parts or repair. That ratio of broken tanks waiting on parts to operational tanks in combat was the German norm. The first 5 Tiger IIs delivered to Panzer-Lehr broke down before they could be used in combat and were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The 501st Heavy Tank Battalion arrived on the Eastern Front with 45 Tiger IIs, of which only 8 were operational on arrival. The rest sidelined by, predictably, and final drive failures. Across the Falaise Pocket and the long retreat from Normandy through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in the late summer and autumn of 1944, the overwhelming majority of German Panther and Tiger losses were not from Allied tank fire. They were from abandonment, fuel exhaustion, mechanical breakdown, and lack of recovery vehicles. In the same period, American maintenance battalions were retrieving disabled Shermans from the same battlefields, often within sight of the same bypassed German formations, and putting them back into combat days later. This was the central asymmetry of the armoured war in the West. The Germans built better tanks, the Americans built better tank systems, and in industrial war, systems beat tanks. It is worth pausing on a popular myth. The line that it took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger has circulated in war movies, paperback histories, and popular memory for the better part of 80 years. There is no documented United States Army study supporting it. Direct Sherman versus Tiger combat was rare, because Tigers themselves were rare. There were never more than about 150 Tigers in Normandy at any time. Most German tank losses came not from Allied tanks at all, but from anti-tank guns, infantry rocket weapons, artillery, and airstrikes. The 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, towed and concealed in hedgerows or tree lines, killed more Allied tanks than every Tiger and Panther combined. The most rigorous modern analysis, by the historian Stephen Zaloga in Armored Thunderbolt, finds that American Sherman units performed roughly on par with their German opponents in direct tank combat across northwestern Europe, and often better. The image of helpless Shermans and unstoppable German cats is, on the historical record, simply false. The 5-tank figure most likely traces to the size of an American tank platoon, which was indeed 5 vehicles. A platoon, not a single tank, was dispatched to engage a heavy threat. The platoon would maneuver, fix the German tank with 1 or 2 of its tanks, and flank it with the others, exploiting the Sherman's faster traverse and tighter turning radius. The Battle of the Bulge, in the winter of 1944 to 1945, was the supreme test of the American maintenance system. Between December 13, 1944, and January 1945, the 1st and 3rd United States Armies lost approximately 145 M5 light tanks, 666 M4 medium tanks, and 249 tank destroyers in the Ardennes. By early January, the United States had committed 9 armored divisions, 17 separate tank battalions, and 25 tank destroyer battalions to the fight. Snow drifted 3 feet deep in places. Temperatures fell below 0 degrees Fahrenheit for days at a time. Recovery teams worked in conditions that broke equipment, froze grease, and turned engine oil into something resembling tar. And it was in the middle of that battle, on the day after Christmas, that Cobra King reached Bastogne. The tank had been damaged the previous month, recovered, repaired, and returned to its crew. Now, a few minutes after 4:50 in the afternoon, it pushed through the last German positions and made contact with the 101st Airborne. Cobra King survives today, restored, on display at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Other Shermans of that battle survive on the ground where they fought. A tank named Barracuda, an M4A 3 of B Company, 41st Tank Battalion, 11th Armored Division, was knocked out at Bastogne on December 30, 1944. It still stands in the town square. In the village of Wibrin, a Sherman knocked out by a Panther on January 14, 1945, has been preserved with its hull penetrations visible. In La Roche-en-Ardenne, an M4A1 with the 76mm gun stands in the town centre as a memorial. These tanks did not return home through a museum acquisition program. Most of them stayed where they died, became weather-worn, were absorbed by the towns that were liberated, and were tended by villagers who remembered what arrived in their streets in the snow. For the men who fixed them, the recognition came late, if it came at all. The Ordnance Corps maintained its institutional memory at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where the United States Army Ordnance Museum operated for decades before being relocated to Fort Lee, now Fort Gregg Adams, in Virginia, in 2010 and 2011. The outdoor displays at Fort Gregg Adams include an M32B3 tank recovery vehicle on horizontal volute spring suspension, one of a handful of these vehicles that survive in original configuration anywhere on Earth. For decades, the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, held one of the largest armored vehicle collections in the world, including operational Shermans and an M32 from the same era. Most of those vehicles moved with the Armor School to Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, in 2011. The American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, owns running Shermans and demonstrates them at public events. The Tank Museum at Bovington, in southern England, houses the M4A1 nicknamed Michael, the second Sherman ever produced at Lima Locomotive Works, and the oldest surviving Sherman in the world, alongside a runner identified as Fury, an M4A 276mm on horizontal volute spring suspension, which appeared in the 2014 film of the same name. A handful of M32s survive elsewhere as well. The Technik Museum Speyer in Germany has a restored M32, one of 46 supplied to West Germany under military assistance in the early 1950s. The Yad L'Shirion Armor Museum at Latrun in Israel preserves at least 3 M32B1s and 3 M32B3s, used by the Israeli Defense Forces through the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War to keep their fleet of upgraded Super Sherman tanks running for decades after the United States Army had retired. The type. The Pakistan Army Museum in Lahore and Ayub National Park in Rawalpindi hold M32s that served until the 1990s. Mexico operated the type, locally nicknamed Chenka, until 1998. In some sense, the Sherman recovery vehicle outlived the Cold War in the service of armies the United States had not foreseen. The 5-echelon maintenance system that the Ordnance Corps built between 1940 and 1945 did not vanish either. It was simplified after the war, eventually consolidated into the 2-level field and sustainment maintenance doctrine that the United States Army uses today. The forward maintenance concept, first piloted in the mobile ordnance repair shops of the First World War and matured in the ordnance maintenance battalions of the Second, became the foundation of all subsequent American military logistics, in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, and in every conflict since. The M32 itself was directly succeeded. In 1954, the United States introduced the M74, built on an upgraded Sherman chassis with horizontal volute spring suspension, used through the early 1960s. It was succeeded in turn by the M88 series, which has been in service in various marks ever since, and remains the heavy recovery vehicle of the United States Army today. The lineage runs unbroken from the men under the tarps in the Belgian wood, lots in 1944 to the recovery sergeants of the modern army. The Sherman did not win the war alone. The Tiger and Panther, for all their flaws, killed plenty of Sherman crews. The Soviet T-34 did the heaviest tank fighting of the war on the Eastern Front. American infantry, artillery, air power, naval gunfire, and economic warfare all contributed to the defeat of the Axis. To say that one weapon won the Second World War is to oversimplify a struggle that consumed 60 million lives and reshaped every continent. But there is a truth at the heart of the Sherman story that goes beyond weapons. Wars fought between industrial nations are won by the side whose system is more durable than its losses. Germany built the better tank. Germany lost. The United States built the better system. The United States, with its allies, won. The men in the maintenance battalions of the 3rd Armored Division, of the 2nd, the 4th, the 6th, the 7th, the 11th, of every armoured division that crossed Europe between 1944 and 1945, did the work that made that victory possible. They scraped human remains out of burned-out tank interiors. They welded plates over shell holes, They cleaned final drives that had run on stripped gears for 50 miles. They patched together replacement crews from spare drivers and reassigned cooks. They worked in mud, snow, rain, and freezing cold, often within range of German artillery, often without sleep, often without thanks. They were not glamorous. They were not, for the most part, decorated. They did not have novels written about them or films made of their work. What they accomplished is one of the great stories of the war. A division that could absorb tank losses many times over its initial strength and remain combat effective. A logistical machine that could move 12,000 tons of supplies a day across a captured continent. A recovery vehicle fleet of over 1,500 armoured tow trucks against a German fleet of fewer than 300. An industrial capacity that produced more tanks in some single factories in some single months than the German Reich produced of certain key types in entire years, and carried through all of it the simple operational fact that a knocked-out Sherman was, more often than not, a future combat tank. The story matters now for reasons beyond pride or memory. It carries a lesson that engineers, planners, and soldiers continue to relearn in every generation. The lesson is that exquisite hardware, however brilliant, is hostage to its own complexity. A weapon that cannot be repaired in the field is a weapon that will be lost in the field. A weapon system, on the other hand, with mediocre individual components but excellent sustainability, can outlast far more sophisticated opponents. The same principle applies to ships, aircraft, missiles, and increasingly to the digital infrastructure of modern war. It is also a lesson about people. The Shermans recovery system worked because it was built on a culture of mechanical literacy that Americans, at that point in their history, had developed to an extraordinary degree. Boys who had taken apart Model T engines in their fathers' garages became men who, 10 years later, could change a final drive on a tank in a Belgian forest at 3 a.m. under blackout conditions. The American educational, industrial, and cultural emphasis on hands-on technical work paid for itself in the form of a maintenance corps that no other army could match. The men who lived through that work are almost all gone now. Belton Cooper died on May 26, 2007. The veterans of the maintenance companies, the medium and heavy ordnance battalions, the recovery platoons of the armoured divisions are very few in any year still living. What remains is the record. The official histories produced by the United States Army Center of Military History, particularly the volume by Leader Mayo on Beachhead and Battlefront in the Green Book series. The technical manuals, the field manuals, and the after-action reports preserved in the National Archives. The Memoirs, including Belton Cooper's, with all its strengths and all its acknowledged limits. The work of historians like Stephen Zaloga, who in Armored Thunderbolt and other books has done more than any single scholar to set the Sherman record straight against decades of myth. The work of Christopher Gable and Charles Bailey on American armored doctrine, the Tank Museum's living vehicles, the Patton Museum's surviving displays, the villages of Belgium and France with their scarred memorial Shermans still on the road, verges. Together they tell a story that the men who lived it were often too modest, too tired, or too dead to tell themselves. When Cobra King ground forward through the snow toward Bastogne on the afternoon of December 26, 1944, it carried the lives of hundreds of paratroopers waiting inside the town. It also carried something else. It carried a quieter signature, the work of the unnamed mechanics who had pulled it out of a French field a few weeks earlier and put it back together. The relief of Bastogne is the iconic moment. The repair before it is the unseen one. Both belong to the same story. The Shermans' victory, in the end, was not a victory of steel. It was a victory of method, of patience, of mass training, of hands and tools, and a belief that what was broken could be made to work again. That belief, more than any single weapon, is what the men of the United States Army Ordnance Corps carried across Europe in 1944 and 1945. And it is the part of their story that has the most to say to anyone still listening, 80 years on.